Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the anatomy of a curse. We're unpacking Psalm 58, an ancient, highly visceral text that tackles a theme that's honestly just as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago, that universal human frustration with systemic injustice. When we think of ancient poetry, it's easy to imagine something dry or detached, right? Well, the document we're unpacking today is the exact opposite. It is a raw, intense, and deeply emotional cry for justice. Just look at this shocking, almost cinematic imagery to start us off. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into slime. Wow. The author isn't just asking for their enemies to be defeated, they're asking for them to be utterly erased. It's startling, it's graphic, and it absolutely forces us to pay attention to the sheer weight of the author's grievance right out of the gate. So, this is the text we're analyzing today. Psalm 58. It's designated as a miktam, which is a specific style of musical poetry attributed to David, and it carries this really fascinating instruction for the choir master, according to do not destroy. It's a beautifully formatted piece of literature, for sure, but as we're about to see, it is an incredibly intense ancient poem. We're going to break down its structure, the footnotes, and the wild metaphors to understand exactly how this text builds its argument against corruption. Let's jump into section 1, the accusation. A cry against injustice. This part of the text is a direct challenge to authority figures who are just totally failing their people. It opens in verse 1 with this highly inquisitive, almost confrontational tone. Do you indeed decree what is right, you gods? Do you judge the children of man uprightly? Right away, the author is literally putting those in power on the stand. It's a rhetorical question, of course. The implied answer is a big, resounding no. The author is directly questioning whether these figures of authority are actually enacting upright justice. It sets up this incredibly sharp contrast between what they're supposed to do and what they're actually doing. Now, what's really fascinating here is a subtle detail you'll find tucked away in a footnote. While the main text says gods, an alternative translation by revocalization suggests mighty lords, and this is a pretty crucial detail. It completely shifts our focus directly onto human corruption. It suggests the author isn't necessarily picking a fight with divine beings, but rather with earthly rulers, magistrates, or kings. The mighty lords who actually hold the physical scales of justice and are actively tilting them in their own favor. Moving on. Verse 2 answers that rhetorical question from the first verse, and man, it reveals the grim reality of these rulers. Notice the physical anatomy used here to describe their corruption. It's their hearts versus their hands. Internally, in your hearts, you devise wrongs. So there's a premeditated, highly calculated nature to their injustice. And then externally, your hands deal out violence on earth. The corruption doesn't just stay neatly hidden in their minds, it manifests as tangible physical violence against the people. Okay, moving right along to section 2, anatomy of the wicked, flawed from birth. Here we move from what these corrupt leaders do to who they fundamentally are. In verse 3, the author makes this huge, sweeping claim. This corruption isn't just a simple mistake, a bad policy, or a momentary lapse in judgment. No, the text claims it's something deeply ingrained from their very origins. They are estranged from the womb and go astray from birth, speaking lies. Basically, the poem is portraying these corrupt leaders as fundamentally broken right from the starting line. It paints a picture of systemic injustice that is so deep it feels practically genetic to the author. And then, the imagery shifts brilliantly to the animal kingdom in verses 4 and 5. The author describes the wicked as possessing venom like the venom of a serpent. They are toxic, right? Their lies and violence are quite literally poisoning the society around them. But the metaphor actually goes deeper than that. They're specifically likened to a deaf adder that stops its ear. So it's not just that they're dangerous, it's that they are willfully ignorant and incredibly stubborn. Let's break down how this metaphor works mechanically. Step 1. The voice of charmers or the cunning enchanter attempts to speak. This clearly represents reason, correction, or maybe pleas for justice. Step 2. The adder deliberately stops its ear. It makes a choice not to hear. And therefore, step 3, the venom remains an unchecked threat. The wicked are deliberately blocking out any voice that might correct them. It makes them utterly unreachable and completely immune to reform. That brings us to section 3, vivid metaphors of destruction, the plea for retribution. Because these corrupt leaders are portrayed as being entirely deaf to reason, the poem takes a hard pivot here. It launches into a rapid-fire sequence of really striking, violent metaphors pleading for their downfall. You can feel the pacing quicken noticeably in verses 6 and 7. Since the rulers literally cannot be reasoned with, the author calls upon God to physically disarm them. O God, break the teeth in their mouths, tear out the fangs of the young lions. It's a desperate plead to neutralize their ability to devour the innocent. The text then shifts to their attacks, saying, when he aims his arrows, let them be blunted. And finally, there's just a raw desire for them to disappear. Let them vanish like water that runs away. We're looking at a comprehensive, multi-layered demand for their absolute, total disarmament. And here in verse 8, it brings back that incredibly vivid, almost bizarre request we saw at the very beginning of the explainer. The author is asking for the absolute erasure and powerlessness of the corrupt. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into slime, like the stillborn child who never sees the sun. Wow, these are incredibly stark, deeply unsettling images, aren't they? Lives and legacies being completely wiped out before they can even leave a slimy mark. It really captures the sheer desperation of the oppressed, just wanting their oppressors to become entirely insignificant. Verse 9 then speaks of sudden, rapid destruction, this time using the imagery of a cooking fire. It says, sooner than your pots can feel the heat of thorns, whether green or ablaze, may he sweep them away. The whole idea here is that justice needs to come faster than a flash fire. Now, interestingly enough, if we look at footnote C, it points out that the exact translation of this specific Hebrew verse actually remains a bit of a mystery to scholars. But honestly, even with a little uncertainty about the exact wording, the overall momentum and the intent of rapid, fiery destruction remain perfectly clear in the context of the poem. Now, let's look at our final section, Section 4, Vindication and Ultimate Reward, the Aftermath of Justice. So we move out of the rapid-fire curses and into the intense aftermath. Verse 10 leaves us with some truly shocking, visceral imagery. It says, the righteous will rejoice when he sees the vengeance. He will bathe his feet in the blood of the wicked. Now, we have to look at this impartially. This represents a remarkably raw, ancient expression of a desire for an undeniable, absolute victory over evil. You have to remember, in a time without complex judicial systems, this graphic metaphor visualizes a complete and total turning of the tables, a scenario where the oppressed are undeniably vindicated. And that brings us to the crucial point. The ultimate philosophical conclusion of the whole poem is found right here at the very end in verse 11. Mankind will say, surely there is a reward for the righteous. Surely there is a God who judges on earth. You see, all of this preceding rage, all those intense metaphors of broken teeth and dissolving snails, it's all ultimately grounded in a desperate human search for a moral order. The author just needs to know that accountability actually exists. Because if there is a judge on earth, well then the suffering of the righteous isn't meaningless, and the violence of the wicked won't go unchecked forever. So, I'll leave you with this final thought. How does this intense, ancient desire for retribution map onto our own modern struggles? When we face systemic wrongs today, does a raw cry for total destruction actually satisfy our need for justice? Or does it merely highlight our profound, timeless yearning for a world where uprightness is truly rewarded? It's a pretty heavy question, but it's one that this fascinating text absolutely forces us to confront.